Hello, this is Mike from Urban Legends and Mythology. On this episode, we are diving into some of rock and roll's greatest mysteries. Now, anybody that's ever met me knows that I love punk rock, heavy metal. I mean, hell, I'm a bass player, so to me, the heavier the better. But those genres are all derivative of rock and roll. Rock and roll was like the granddaddy of these genres. And where you get rock and roll, you get a ton of urban legends and mysteries and myths. And using rock and roll as the springboard, I'm going to dive into some of these urban legends and myths today. And don't worry, I'm not going to talk about Robert Johnson again. That is one of my favorite kind of urban legends about the earliest days of blues and rock and roll. But I've discussed that legend about 4 times now throughout this series, so maybe go back to seasons 1 and 2, even 3, and listen to them again. And speaking of some of those earlier episodes, if the sound quality is just too cringe for you, because to be honest, when I go back and listen to them, it's too cringe for me, I am re-recording, updating, and remastering some of those episodes for future releases, so be on the lookout for those. But let's find a rabbit hole and just dive deep into it. So we'll start with the conspiracy theory about Paul McCartney. So let's start at the beginning. Literally anybody who knows anything about music knows who Paul McCartney is. He was the bassist and one of the lead songwriters for the Beatles. He is widely regarded as one of the most successful composers and songwriters of the modern era. He has had a long and illustrious music career, and he is just a legend in the music industry. But what a lot of people of my generation, millennials and younger generations, might not know is that he's dead. Now, don't worry, the guy who we all know and love is Paul McCartney. He's not some 81-year-old shambling, reanimated corpse from Haitian Beaucourt or something. According to this conspiracy theory, and it's been a long time since I've said that, feels like season 1 all over again, the guy we know as Paul McCartney today isn't Paul McCartney. He was a look-alike, a replacement, who took the original Paul McCartney's place in 1966 when the original Paul McCartney died in a tragic car accident on the M1. So essentially the gist of the story goes that in January of 1966, Paul McCartney, he was leaving this recording session late at night, and he's involved in this fatal car crash. And this is the time when the Beatles are really blowing up in popularity. They are one of the biggest bands in the world at this time. So naturally something like a tragic sudden death of one of these rock icons would put the whole country in grief. So fearing that his death was going to put the whole country in grief, the Beatles, along with Britain's MI5, which is kind of like an internal security service. I think the closest amalgam we have here in America would be our Department of Homeland Security or something like that. They all get together and they concoct this ruse that they were going to say that this car accident was just a minor car accident. It looks worse than it is. Paul McCartney is perfectly fine. And behind the scenes, these MI5 guys are scouring the countryside looking for the perfect look-alike to replace McCartney. And this is all fueled by real rumors that were taking place in tabloids and rock and roll magazines. It harkens back to that idea of yellow journalism. Doesn't matter if the facts are true, you just gotta sell those magazines, you want to sell those newspapers. And by this time, the band was riddled with rumors, especially concerning McCartney. There were rumors that he was planning on leaving the band to do his own solo projects. There were rumors as early as 1966 that the band was going to break up for good. But the Paul is dead conspiracy theory is one that really comes to dominate the last few years when the band was together. And it's said that the band, in a tongue-in-cheek manner, would play along with it sometimes. And post-1966, when these rumors are kind of circulating, we start seeing all these little cryptic clues to suggest that maybe this rumor was true. It's said that in the artwork of some of their later albums, they had these clues within that pointed towards the rumor. And in certain songs, there were some backmasked messages that stated that Paul was dead. And when TV show hosts and interviewers would ask him directly about this rumor, they would usually give these weird cryptic answers about the whole thing. So it was like they were playing along with the joke, or probably just trolling these people. But like the conspiracy theory guys, like the tinfoil hat guys like us here at the show, they were looking at all these clues and they were piecing them together, and it was like reconfirming that outcome that they already had in their mind, that Paul was dead and this new guy was a replacement. So the most famous clue that we get is from the cover of Abbey Road. We've all seen that iconic album cover. However, if you look closely on that album cover, you'll see some things that stand out. The first thing you notice is they all look like they're marching in step, or lockstep, except for Paul McCartney. If you look at him, he's walking out of step. A lot of people have interpreted that as a message stating that he is out of step with the living world. Secondly, if you look a little bit closer, Paul McCartney is walking across the street barefoot, while the remaining 3 Beatles are all wearing shoes. This might allude to the idea that this new guy has yet to fill the shoes of their missing bandmate. It's supposed to be that idiom of trying to fill another man's shoes. And then a lot of people will point to the license plate on the back of the Volkswagen Beetle in the background. The license plate has the letters and numbers LMW 281F. Or some people read it as 28IF, or 28 if, representing that if he had lived to this date, he would have been 28 years old. And LMW is supposed to stand for Linda McCartney Weeps. And the entire cover of Abbey Road is said to represent a funeral procession. And it's not just the Abbey Road album cover that has these cryptic clues. On Sgt. Pepper, if you look at that album artwork, it's also riddled with all this cryptic weird stuff. So the flowers on that album cover are said to represent McCartney's left-handed bass. Next, if you look at where the Hindu god Shiva is pointing, now Shiva is known as the Destroyer. Shiva is pointing directly at McCartney, and the badge that we see on McCartney's arm says OPD. A lot of people have interpreted that as officially pronounced dead. Then we get to the Magical Mystery Tour record, where the name of the Beatles is written in stars, and apparently if you hold that up to a mirror, it shows the number of a London mortuary. Many of photos in the included booklet showed McCartney again without shoes, which I didn't touch on this earlier, but there's this sense that, not having shoes on signifies you're dead, because normally when you're in a casket, you're not wearing shoes. Another image in this booklet shows Ringo's drumhead apparently saying, "Love the 3 Beatles," and next to that drum kit are a pair of McCartney's boots supposedly covered in bloodstains. And there's various other images we get from album covers and booklets, pretty much from everything written beyond 1966. But there were also said to be hints and other clues found in the songs, especially with like mutterings or backmasking. So for example, at the end of their song Strawberry Fields Forever, Lennon is muttering the words cranberry sauce, or I like cranberry sauce, or something like that. However, a lot of people interpreted that, and still interpret it today, as him saying, "I buried Paul." At the end of I Am the Walrus, you hear "Bury My Body" and "Oh Untimely Death." And at the end of the song I'm So Tired, John Lennon is said to be muttering the words, "Monsieur, Monsieur, Monsieur, how about another one?" And when that's played backwards, it's quickly heard as the now iconic line, "Paul is dead, man. Miss him, miss him, miss him." And I'll be honest, little phrases and snippets like that in backmasking, you always have to take with a grain of salt, because I can pull any album out of my collection right now, play it backwards, and depending on what I hear, I can interpret that however I want. Especially in a case like this where John Lennon seems to be kind of mumbling or muttering in the background. Mumblings and mutterings can be interpreted as just about anything. It's kind of along the same lines as to why I don't really like EVP, Electronic Voice Phenomena. I discussed this back in my Ohio Urban Legends episode, because it's too open to interpretation. There's no real hard science there. But I've been going down all the clues and stuff, so let's say this were all true. Well, who is this imposter who we know is Sir Paul McCartney today? Well, according to the conspiracy theory, that is a man named William Campbell. So William Campbell has no history, no birth record, anything like that. However, he shows up at this Paul McCartney lookalike contest, in which we have no date. And he was the winner of that contest. And during this incident, when MI6 is kind of scouring the countryside looking for a replacement while the Beatles are in mourning, they come across this guy and ask him, hey, you want to be famous? And apparently the reason why we don't have any records of William Campbell is because MI5, along with the British government, scrubbed his background. He was reborn that day as Paul McCartney, and he still lives as Sir Paul McCartney to this day, while the real Paul McCartney lies in a grave under a false name, possibly something like William Campbell. But now we come to ask ourselves, is any of this true? Well, no, not a word of it. Everything I had mentioned in the last 10 minutes is 100% BS. Well, like 95, some of it's true. Paul McCartney is an amazingly talented artist, that part is true. And the Beatles did have a lot of weird imagery and stuff during this era. Remember, this is the height of the hippie movement. LSD was free-flowing. They were stoned half the time. It went on to inspire a lot of their art. But all the little clues in the photographs and the references, they can all be debunked. For example, in Abbey Road, when we see that car with that license plate that says 28 if, well, Paul McCartney was only 27 when that album came out. Furthermore, he didn't meet Linda until about a year later, so it wouldn't make sense that the letters on that license plate stands for Linda McCartney Weeps. And the officially pronounced dead patch on Sgt. Pepper, well, that's not that at all. It's Ontario Police Department. That badge just happened to be on the jacket he was wearing at the time because, he probably got it at a thrift store and it probably looked good on that album art. Also, we have evidence that William Campbell never existed, and that lookalike contest never existed, simply from the fact that it was made up by a man named Fred Laborde. He was a writer for the Michigan Daily who was just looking for a hot story to cash in on. And a lot of these rumors were perpetuated in that same way. These were fueled by publishers and journalists who were more interested in selling their rags with these sensationalized stories instead of actually just pursuing the truth, which is why I'll say it, and I'll say it over and over again. Journalism is dead. Modern integrity does not exist in journalism. Hell, just flip on the news. I defy anybody to show me a journalist today who isn't a sensationalist or just chasing ratings. None of them, not a single one of them, seem to have integrity anymore, but I digress. Now, the idea that the Beatles were perpetuating the rumor or trolling anybody who was kind of into this rumor, that's a little bit harder to say because they were aware of this rumor that was floating around. And it seems like maybe in a tongue-in-cheek manner, they probably played into it a little bit. But there were other times, and this was most of the time, when they were like, no, you're crazy. Go away. I don't even know why this rumor exists. And I guess after a while, they just got sick of being asked that question because even by 1970, even John Lennon literally called the whole thing bullshit. But this is one of those urban legends in the music world that has stood the test of time because I remember hearing this back in 5th, 6th grade whenever I was first introduced to the Beatles. And I admit at the time it was one of those myths and rumors that I really wanted to be true because I thought it was very clever and very awesome. And even in my adult life, I always wanted it to be true. But unfortunately, with the rise of things like the internet as we know it today, and my work on this show, I was able to quickly debunk it. Which, like I said, it's kind of sad because I don't set out to debunk urban legends or the mysteries of life. I mean, hell, I love these subjects and I encourage people to seek them out because they're fascinating and fun. I mean, with just Paul is Dead alone, there have been countless articles and, YouTube videos and documentaries and whatnot made on that subject. And the nuances and the mysteries and the clue hunting, that's all in the fun of it. But sadly for me, it is one that is unfortunately debunked, unless that's exactly what Paul McCartney wants us to think. But moving on from the dead, let's go into some myths about the living. So one of the most iconic rock and roll stars that everybody swears is still alive is the King, Elvis Presley. Now, anybody who has grandparents who grew up in the 50s know exactly who Elvis Presley is. He was the guy who really made rock and roll popular amongst the white middle class of America in the 50s. And to be honest, before he came along, this genre, or the genre that became rock and roll, was considered black music. It was derivative of music styles like boogie woogie and blues, which were prominent in the South amongst black performers. And as a result, racist white people in the 50s, they naturally looked down upon these styles of music. It wasn't played on the radio. The record sales weren't that impressive. However, in the 50s, you have the likes of people like Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis coming along, and even later ones like Buddy Holly. And that all of a sudden creates this, cultural shift, and all of a sudden this music is considered okay. And Elvis Presley, he gets a lot of credit for kind of leading the way because he was kind of the first rock star to be on television and radio playing this music. But even these artists, they would credit artists like Chuck Berry and Little Richard as being kind of the foundation of this new style. But with all the focus being on Elvis, he becomes this iconic legend, and a lot of urban legends crop up around him during and even after his life. Now, a lot of the urban legends associated with Elvis are kind of innocuous, like the legend that he basically invented the peanut butter and banana and bacon sandwich. However, while that sandwich becomes associated with him because it was, one of his favorite things to eat, he wasn't really the inventor of that. That's existed forever. However, chowing down a bunch of those would explain why he had all that weight gain in his later years, side with the barbiturate addiction and stuff, but I digress. And speaking of his later years, his fat years, there's a common urban legend that he died on the toilet while eating a cheeseburger. And while, yes, he did tragically die on the toilet, however, he wasn't eating a cheeseburger at the time. No cheeseburger was found when his wife found him in that position. But that brings us to the ultimate myth of all, is he really dead? Because that's the longest and enduring urban legend around Elvis Presley. Now, a lot of people think that he faked his death because the pressures of fame were just essentially taking a toll on his life. He had been in the spotlight at this point for over 20 years, and he just wanted to essentially disappear into anonymity. And to be perfectly honest, the late 70s would have been a perfect time for him to disappear, because at this time he's in his early 40s and he's already pretty much accomplished everything an American could want to accomplish. He was a rock star, a military veteran, an actor, a millionaire. However, towards the end of his career and the end of his life, he was kind of disillusioned by the whole thing. He had this ongoing battle with barbiturates, his health was in decline, and he started living a very reclusive life even within the walls of his own mansion. He pretty much confines himself to his bedroom, and he doesn't make a lot of public appearances. And the public appearances he does make is really a struggle. During this time, it was obvious that his health was rapidly deteriorating, and this was all in the public's eye. So you can imagine how much of a toll that would take on top of all of this. So the official story is he eventually deteriorates in health, and one day in 1977, while he's sitting on the toilet, he suffers some kind of cardiac arrest event and he dies right there. However, since we have to indulge in the conspiracy side of it, the conspiracy states that Elvis, along with some of his key insiders, along with the FBI, and he did have an ongoing relationship with the FBI because throughout his life, he was the recipient of many death threats. Let's not forget, this is still America and people are insane. So Elvis, along with his crew and the FBI, they orchestrate this plan that he's just going to disappear. Now, one theory alleges that the FBI actually helped him get into the witness protection program and disappear that way because of these death threats in his past. But personally, I don't really see that as a possibility that it went through the FBI because WITSEC, the Witness Protection Program, it's run by the U.S. Marshals Department. Now, while I guess the FBI could get a hold of the U.S. Marshals Department and say, hey, can we put this high-value guy into WITSEC, it's probably unlikely that that happened, especially when you have an icon that everybody in the world knows. And for that to have happened, it would have required the silence of hundreds, if not thousands, of people over the years who would have participated in a program to make Elvis disappear. Now, some people will point to the autopsy reports. They'll say there were 2 different autopsy reports. Why was this? And to be honest, I'm pretty sure that's just because his father requested a second autopsy to happen, because I guess in their minds they weren't really 100% sure about the cause of death and they wanted to investigate that. But the biggest theories of all come from the fact that the dude has just been sighted all over the place. Even today, people still claim that they're sighting like 87-year-old Elvis showing up at like the grocery store and stuff. There was a famous sighting or series of sightings in the 80s in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And there have been sightings of him everywhere and allegations that he's living in California, New York, the Caribbean, and even in the Playboy Mansion. And that was an urban legend that came out, I think, in the 70s or 80s about this mysterious room in the Playboy Mansion called the Elvis Room. It was alleged that one night in the 1970s that Elvis just kind of showed up at the mansion, had this wild party with like 8 Playboy bunnies in that room, and after that night, they sealed it up, never to be accessed again. And how that urban legend rolls into the one about his disappearance comes back to the fact that in his final months or year or so, he was very reclusive, and that he was essentially living in the Playboy Mansion and still is today in that room, and that's why it's sealed up. However, that myth was kind of debunked in 2017 by a former Playboy bunny. It stated that while Hugh one time did lend Elvis his private jet, he was never a guest at the mansion. And to be honest, there is no Elvis room. But you know, when it comes to a good old conspiracy theory about a celebrity, we all just know that he's still out there. Hell, he might have become an Elvis impersonator and he's performing weddings in Las Vegas right now. Or he's running a donut shop somewhere in, I don't know, Kalamazoo, Michigan, for example. Or according to the hit film Men in Black, he didn't die, he just went home. But that's kind of an American thing. It's like I said, I think in a previous episode, where our heroes, if you can call them a hero, I guess I'll say our iconic figures, they don't die. They're Americans. They scratch out a new reality somewhere else. They live on forever, even if it is in a conspiracy theory. And that's kind of why there are so many conspiracy theories out there about these like rock and roll icons, these legends, these celebrities that, no, they didn't die, they're still alive. They're on some island in the Caribbean, or they're running a Dunkin's Donuts in a mall in North Dakota, and I don't know, watching old VHS tapes about their previous life. But these theories aren't always about who's dead and who's alive, who faked their death or who has a replacement or whatever. A lot of living artists, especially in the music world, especially in the rock and roll world, have tons of urban legends and myths about them. Some of the most iconic bands who were coming out in the 70s. So of course I'm going to talk about Black Sabbath, one of, if not the greatest metal band of all time. I mean, they laid the foundations of what we call heavy metal today. And I touched a little bit on them in my Satan episode. Season 3 finale, go check it out, it was awesome. And how they were one of the main targets when it came to music during the satanic panic of the 80s. But it was their leading frontman, Ozzy Osbourne, who has so many myths surrounding him that it's insane. The dude is an absolute living legend. Now, I'm not going to go into like a big deep dive about like the history of Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne. If this were like a heavy metal podcast, I'd totally do that, but let's just riff a little on some of the urban legends surrounding this band. And the earliest one comes from the satanic panic of the 70s and 80s. They thought that these band members were Satanists. And to be honest, that's probably the most enduring urban legend, because even to this day, they're affiliated with that dark imagery which plays so well in the horror genre. But it's not because they are Satanists. They actually got the idea to indulge in that kind of horror, dark imagery because they had realized that it was very popular in the 70s. They kind of came up with the whole idea after they were like jamming at this one little place where they practice at. And then at this theater across the street, they saw all these people lined up for this horror film called Black Sabbath. And they were basically like, why don't we tap into that popularity? All of a sudden, Ozzy Osbourne becomes the motherfucking Prince of Darkness, and boom, a legend is born. But even they would say that they weren't into that stuff personally. They used to have people come to their early shows who were like Satanists and stuff. They had their own little cults or whatever. And they'd basically be like, get the fuck out of here. You guys are weird. But that idea kind of gets out into the media, and it gets to the point where like people wouldn't even listen to their music because they were afraid it would like put some kind of like satanic spell on them or something. But what really kind of throws them into those realms of urban legend is just some of the stuff surrounding their antics. Now, it was known that they were heavy drug users. A lot of people in the music industry during this time were heavy cocaine users. And even their frontman, Ozzy Osbourne, he's been kind of notorious for his struggles with drug and alcohol addiction. But one of the rumors that kind of circulates from that was that in 1972 alone, they had a, quote, cocaine budget of up to $75,000. And they would have, like, access to, like, the best and purest Colombian cocaine, and it would be flown into their studio via private jet. But the band collectively did decide to kind of kick the cocaine habit in 1973 after recording Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, which was recorded at this haunted Welsh castle. So they go to this haunted castle and they're like, we're going to record this album, you know, because it's an old castle. It's probably got great acoustics already built in. And they're all, you know, blitzed out on Colombian marching powder, so they're probably paranoid as fuck at the same time while thinking about all these ghost stories that they're hearing around this castle. It got to the point where Bill was so afraid he was sleeping with a dagger every night. And at one point, Tony and Ozzy, they see the apparition of a ghost and they follow it through the castle until it eventually disappears. But the castle nearly kills Ozzy. So one of the rooms in this castle had this huge fireplace, and one night Ozzy, he has this big roaring fire going. It looks friggin' awesome. And he falls asleep in that room on the couch or a bed or something, I don't know. And a hot burning coal just kind of tumbles out of the fireplace onto the carpet, and it sets the whole room ablaze. It actually sets Ozzy's foot on fire, but the rest of the band, they kind of like force their way into the room and drag him out of there. And it was at that moment where they were basically like, not only do we need to get the fuck out of this haunted ass castle, but we need to kick this cocaine habit because it's making us fucking paranoid as shit and it's gonna destroy us mentally. So eventually, you know, as time goes on, Ozzy and the band part ways, mostly due to his drug use, and he starts his solo career. Now, during this time, late 70s, early 80s, he's still trying to cultivate that, like, Prince of Darkness image. And in order to set a more, I guess, grisly mood at his shows, he started bringing in, like, pig's intestines and calf livers and, like, pelting them at the audience. And this kind of got out into the media that he was doing this, so future concert goers would start bringing in, like, cuts of meat and even small dead animals, which they would toss onto the stage. And this is where the infamous bat scene comes in. Now, this did actually happen. So Ozzy's performing and some kid throws a bat on the stage and it's like unconscious or stunned or something. Well, Ozzy picks it up thinking it's a toy bat, and as kind of a joke, he puts the head in his mouth, and the damn thing like wakes up and starts flapping around. And as, I guess, a reflex, when he went to pull it out of his mouth, he bit down on it and pulled its head off. And that story just kind of lives on as a true story, but it's still kind of an urban legend to this day. And even that, it kind of gives early rise to the thought of these metal bands like killing chickens and other kinds of poultry, I guess. Because it's funny, because around this time, I think it was in the 80s when Alice Cooper was performing, somebody threw a live chicken on stage, and when he threw it back into the crowd, they literally ripped this chicken apart. And this urban legend started kind of popping up around him that he was killing live chickens at his show. And he actually went on a talk show and was asked this question, and his response was, I don't have any interest in killing chickens. Colonel Sanders kills chickens. I'm just a singer and performer. But that stuff, those rumors, that dark imagery around like metal music, it still exists to this day. Anytime I mention to somebody that I'm a metalhead, I love heavy metal, they look at me like I'm a devil worshiper or I have anger issues or something. But to be honest, any metal concert I've ever been to, I've actually met the nicest people in the world at those shows. I've never met a metalhead with like anger issues, but you know who I have met who has severe anger issues? Hippies. Hippies pretend to be nice, but they are actually very rude, inconsiderate, mean people with short tempers. But I have never once in my life seen a metalhead, and I've been to hundreds of metal shows. I've never seen a metalhead punch another metalhead in anger. Now, that's just my own personal experience. I can't say that that goes for everywhere in the world. But I think there's like an anger or violent stigma around heavy metal that really rose out of these early ideas of dark imagery and I guess like, I don't know, animal mutilations. But it all is attractive to like, I guess, edgy teenagers who are dealing with all the angst or trying to process some anger issues. Because the conservatives, the courts, those like crazy like Christian mothers against everything, they've historically and still to this day will try to blame everything on heavy metal music. Ozzy Osbourne was actually sued multiple times, and I guess there was like a federal investigation into some of his albums because some of his younger fans, unfortunately, were dealing with some kind of mental illness and committed suicide. And in pure 80s satanic panic fashion, these self-appointed so-called experts said it was due to subliminal messages in his music. It's said that in Ozzy Osbourne's song Suicide Solution, which is actually about struggles with alcohol and addiction and mental illness and stuff, some like dick prosecutor tried to argue that he was subliminally like in the range of sound where it's not really audible, saying, get the gun, shoot, 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 which is 100% completely false. That never happened, but these self-appointed experts and this dick lawyer or whatever he was claiming that it was happening. Now, that's not to say that subliminal messages don't have power. Donate. They can be very powerful tools in audio and visual media. There were actually studies done in movie theaters in the 50s where they would show one frame, so 1/130th of a second, which is faster than the human eye can blink, of various images saying stuff like, "Are you hungry? Try popcorn." Or simply the words hungry and popcorn kind of over and over again throughout this film. And they said that during the run, during like this couple of weeks or whatever, popcorn sales rapidly increased. Give me your money. However, there has never been any instance of any artist really putting subliminal messages in any of their music. It's just entirely unethical and not cool at all. You love this podcast. Yet that is another urban legend that endures, and it endures to this day. They would even repeat these same scary ideas when they tried to demonize Marilyn Manson after the Columbine shooting. A lot of conspiracy theorists around that tragedy state that just simply because these boys listened to Marilyn Manson, that subliminally they got the idea to commit that tragedy. And of course, Marilyn Manson, his entire character is an urban legend in and of itself. You know, he really rose to prominence in the late 80s and early 90s as what we would call a shock rocker today. He was doing all this shocking stuff. He was pushing these artistic boundaries to the extremes. And, you know, those conservative groups, they really jumped on him when they found out he was an atheist. I mean, you rip up one Bible on stage and all of a sudden you're like the worst thing that ever walked the face of the planet. Although the one urban legend that was always endured with him actually comes from when I was a kid. So this would be the 90s. And it's that classic urban legend that he had one of his ribs removed so he could perform fellatio upon himself. Now, to be honest, I actually have no idea where that urban legend started or came from. But if I were to pick between that and an urban legend where like I died on the toilet eating a cheeseburger, I'd probably go with that one just because it's more humorous. Because if you're going to create an urban legend about yourself, you might as well make it funny. And these urban legends still go on to this day. Even in the last 10, 20 years, there have been thousands of them. There was the infamous one from when I was in like high school or maybe college, I don't remember, where Avril Lavigne died early in her career and she has been replaced by a lookalike. There are a ton of rumors about Beyonce and her affiliation with the Illuminati. And there's even a conspiracy theory right now about Taylor Swift. There's actually two of them that are floating around the media right now. One is that her and Travis Kelce of the Kansas City Chiefs are going to have a baby, and that baby is going to be the Antichrist. That Taylor is the clone of Zena Sherrick, Anton LaVey's daughter, and former high priestess of the Church of Satan. So even to this day, our rock icons are surrounded by a sea of conspiracy theories and dumbass urban legends, and it seems like that satanic panic has never gone away. And on that note, I think I'm going to end this episode here. As always, this is Mike, and if you enjoyed this episode, all I ask is that you maybe share it with a friend.
You love this podcast.
Follow it on all the social medias.
You're a slave to social media.
And if you really want to make a difference, you can always follow that link in the description of every episode and donate a little bit of money.
All of your money. Your entire savings account.
You people who are doing that already are the true rock stars, which really keeps the show alive. And it really helps out when making future episodes. And speaking of which, I will see you in the next one.